This is Unit 5, Lesson 4, Erosion. So our learning target for this lesson, I can name the types of erosion, and I can compare and contrast the erosion caused by running water and glaciers. So in this lesson, I will be reviewing 4 different types of things that can cause erosion, so we want to be able to give a name to them, and then we also want to be able to think about the way that running water and glaciers cause erosion and how they're different and also how they're similar. So our success criteria, I can list the types of erosion, and I can compare and contrast geologic features caused by running water and glaciers. So in our success criteria, and we look at this word geologic features, we're thinking about things that are formed. Geologic features are, so a feature is something that you're looking at, it's a large structure. So we're looking at these kind of large things that have been created by different types of erosion, and I'll point them out as we go through them. So our first type of erosion that we're going to talk about today is wind erosion. So this thing called sandblasting, also known as abrasion, occurs when wind blows sand or silt grains against rocks and other objects. Now, we did talk about abrasion being a type of weathering, which it is. So weathering is the breaking down of rocks. It also, though, causes the rocks to move. So as these rocks are breaking down here at the bottom, they're also being transported or moved to new locations. So as I was saying when I started this unit, weathering and erosion can happen at the same time, but they are different processes, so we just want to make sure we understand the difference. Now, when we're talking about this, we're talking about just the transport of these materials. So these lower parts of the rocks become more eroded and they start to move more, and it creates rounded and frosted sediments. So when we did the lab and we had the sugar cubes in our container, when we shook it up, the sugar cubes became rounded along the edges, so they no longer had those nice sharp square edges like they did when they first took them out of the box. So that's what we mean by rounded. And frosted is sort of what you would see almost maybe at the beach. Things that have been hit a lot. It's not like clear anymore. It kind of has like a little bit of a white coating on it, and that's just because it's being kind of pummeled. So here's another example of a rock that's been weathered and eroded by abrasion. And when we look at abrasion, we're really looking at desert areas, so areas that don't have a lot of rainfall. And the other thing I want to point out is that I want you to notice that the weathering is occurring mostly along the bottom of this rock, and that has to do with the how high the wind is able to carry the sediment. So sand is being moved by wind, but it can only get so high above the ground, so the sand is only going to really break down this bottom part of the rock, which is why this top part here remains more untouched or less weathered. So the next type of erosion that we're going to talk about is running water. So this is going to be our most common erosion type, and this really refers to any kind of water that's moving. So this could be rivers, streams, or waves. So it's not just like beach or just river. It's all of these things. The greater velocity is going to transport larger particles. So this word velocity means speed. It kind of makes sense. The faster the water is moving, the larger size particle that it can take with it. Creates smooth and rounded sediments. Again, think about the sugar cube. When you shake a sugar cube inside a container full of other rocks, it's going to create those nice rounded edges. It's going to kind of take the edges off. So water is going to do the same thing. This process is also can be called abrasion. Things are hitting against one another as they're being transported and moved down the stream. So remember, the erosion part is the movement. The weathering part is happening while it's moving. And when running water moves through areas, it creates what we call a V-shaped valley. And I'll show you a picture, but this is that geologic feature that I mentioned in the learning target and success criteria, a V-shaped valley. So here's a valley, here's a river running through, and when you look at it, it sort of has a shape like a letter V, right? It's sharp on either side. That's how we know that valley was created by running water. Because as that water moves through over time, it starts to wear down and wear down and wear down more, creating a nice little valley. The third kind of erosion that we're going to talk about is glacier erosion. So we talked about running water, so that's obviously water in a liquid form. Now we're going to talk about water that is solid. or mostly solid. So a glacier is a naturally created mass of ice and snow that moves under the influence of gravity. So glaciers do move, they just don't move very quickly. So they kind of travel downhill, just like water is going to travel downhill through the force of gravity. They just move rather slowly, but they're very, very large. And so when they move, they just pick up anything that's underneath. And as it's picking up all these things that it's moving, so if you imagine a big piece of ice pushing down through a valley, it's picking up all these rocks and pieces of sand and anything that it's kind of that's loose as it's traveling, it's picking up with it, and it's scratching the bedrock underneath. So the bedrock is the rock under the soil, like directly under the soil, that's kind of like closest to our feet. So that glacier is going to scratch that bedrock as it carries boulders and pebbles and sand along with it. And we can tell what direction a glacier is moving by looking at scratches on bedrock. So Staten Island and New York City used to be covered in ice. And if you go to Central Park and you know what you're looking for, you can actually see, I'm going to come back to that in a second, but you can actually see the, they call them glacial striations, the marks in the rock from when the glacier was moving over it. So here we have a rock from Central Park. It's a metamorphic rock. I know that because it has foliation, so it's kind of twisted and a little bit deformed. It also contains glacial striae, meaning marks from glaciers, from those pebbles and other things scraping along. And if you look at the direction the striations are going, and then you can also figure out which direction downhill is, you can figure out how the glacier was moving. So I'm going to go back to this U-shaped valley thing. So this is the other geologic feature here that I wanted to talk about. And instead of making a V-shaped valley like the stream, it carves out a nice big one. And that has to do with the size of the glacier because it's so large. So what normally will happen is a glacier is going to follow the path that water would have followed. So maybe it started as a V-shaped valley, but then the climate changed and we ended up in a colder climate where you could have glaciers forming. So the glacier moves through what was originally a V-shaped valley and just kind of carved the edges out, creating a U shape. And the sediment, so the pieces of rocks that it moves around with it, are going to be sort of rounded, but not as rounded as water because they're not really bumping against things as much as in the water. And they're going to have scratches. So that's kind of your giveaway that something was formed by a glacier. So here's another example of this U shape. So you just want to look when you have a question about valleys created by different forces of erosion or agents of erosion. It's going to be clear whether it's a nice rounded U or if it's a pointy V. So this is a U-shaped valley again. And here's another one. And then our last, we call them agents of erosion or forces of erosion, is erosion caused by gravity. So just to review this concept, gravity is the force that attracts a body toward the center of the earth or towards any other physical body having mass. So basically it's what keeps us, standing on the Earth's surface rather than floating around in the atmosphere. So things that are, located at a high elevation, if they're not stable, that force of gravity is going to pull them down. So when rocks fall or are pulled downward by the force of gravity, we call this erosion caused by gravity. And there's two types of erosion caused by gravity. We have fast and we have slow. And I'm going to go through each of these separately. So our erosion by gravity that happens fast, we have three of them that I'll talk about. We have landslides. So that's the sudden mass erosion of rocks down a hill or land down a hill. A mud flow is the rapid mass erosion of mud. And then a rock slide is a mass erosion of rocks on a cliff. So landslide doesn't have to just be rocks. It could be, all of the land along with it as well. So here's an example of a rock slide or a landslide. We don't have to really get too specific about the definitions or the differences between these two, but something happened to destabilize this location. Generally speaking, it has to do with water. So if there's a lot of rain in an area and it kind of loosens the soil or loosens up the rocks and they're no longer really structurally connected to one another, it can fall. This can also happen as a result of an earthquake. So when you have earthquakes happen, you can get a landslide. If you have volcanoes, a lot of times volcanoes have earthquakes that go with them. So those can also cause landslides. But there has to be something that sort of destabilizes the land. So I'm going to show you a video. This is a landslide that happened in Norway. So I know you can't hear it, but here we have these houses. I think there's 8 houses here. And this whole piece of land is just being dragged out into the ocean, which is really pretty terrifying if that's your house. Right, so you can get the idea. So that's all just moving downhill. And again, all of this stuff is moving downhill. So that idea of gravity, although we didn't talk about it in a lot of detail, is really super important to this unit because gravity is what's going to keep everything kind of moving. And it's also giving us the direction. So downhill is the way that things flow because gravity pulls things down. Then last kind of erosion by gravity we call it slow erosion by gravity. There's 2 examples. We have earth flow. So it's sort of like a landslide, but it's happening slowly. It's not happening as quickly. And then we have creep, which is the slow downward movement of rock and soil down a low grade slope, so not a super steep one. Now this picture here, this is an example of creep. This is not a super steep hill, but what I want you to notice here in this image is the fence posts. At some point when they were installed, they were not installed at that angle, right? You install fence posts straight up and down, but the land over time has started to slowly just kind of roll down that hill, taking along with it the fence posts, and then the trees, if you'll notice too, if you can see it, these trunks are actually starting to sort of point out sideways, just like the fence rails, but then the tree wants to grow straight, so it sort of corrects itself, but it gives a bend to the trunk in the tree there. And that's the last type of erosion we're going to talk about. So just to recap, there were 4 types of erosion that I discussed. We have erosion by wind, erosion by water, running water specifically, so waves, waves, streams, rivers. Erosion by glaciers is our third, and our final is erosion by gravity. And there are 2 kinds. We have fast and slow. So just to look at our learning target, naming the types of erosion, so I just did that for you. Comparing and contrasting erosion caused by running water and glaciers. And then comparing and contrasting the geologic features caused by running water and glaciers. So you want to think about the way that the running water and the glaciers really makes the land look once they move through them.